We're definitely naming our kids Cher!
There's a fun gag in the mid-credits sequence of Deadpool 2 where the character interrupts a scene from X-Men Origins Wolverine.
Wait, is that you?
Hey, it's me. Don't scratch. One day your old pal Wade's gonna ask you to get back in the saddle again. When he does, say yes.
Oh, right.
It's a funny bit, Deadpool symbolically wiping that awkward phase of his filmic history from memory, using some comedically timed Hugh Jackman reaction shots from 2009. It's cute, especially the thinly veiled reality that it's basically just Reynolds making a heartfelt plea to do another movie with his mate. But even when I first saw this back in 2018, I couldn't help but feel that something was vaguely threatening about it all. You see, it was a year before this that Hugh Jackman seemingly had hung up the claws in James Mangold's Logan, a stripped-back character piece that sought to conclude 17 years worth of the actor's history playing this particular version of Wolverine and go out on a high. And it really was a conclusion in every sense of the word. Spoiler, the famously indestructible hero dies at the end once and for all, laying to rest this depiction's cinematic lifespan, seemingly never to be dug up again. No sequel teases, no after credits scene, this was, for all intents and purposes, the end for Hugh Jackman's Wolverine.
Hi, Peanut. I'm gonna need you to come with me right now. Let's fucking go! Let's fucking go.
Or was it? You see, in the comic books, Deadpool and Wolverine have this long history as a sort of bantering odd couple. It always seemed like a kind of chemistry Reynolds and Jackman understood and could quite easily tap into. The only problem was, they never got the timing right. The Deadpool franchise had only just found its feet as the Wolverine zeitgeist was coming to a close. So how have they got around this? Well, we've been told, you see, this isn't the Wolverine from Logan, or presumably the one from all the other movies. This is a Wolverine from an alternate dimension, with a slightly tweaked backstory. Now sporting a more accurately colourful superhero costume, audiences can rest assured that the character as depicted in Logan can rest comfortably in his grave, while enjoying Jackman back in the role once more, without necessarily contradicting that storyline. Everyone's happy, right? Well, not everyone. See, there's this bit towards the end of Logan's second act that feels kind of predictive. The introduction of a new big bad brings Logan face to face with a man who looks just like him. The villainous institution of the film has cloned this guy from his DNA and unleashed him on our heroes to raise all hell. This guy is also played by Hugh Jackman. He has the claws, the trademark rage, he's even got the beard. Some would take a look at this guy and go, yep, checks out, that's Hugh Jackman's Wolverine. The only thing is, it's not. It's a warning.
Boys are so silly.
Now, in all fairness, Deadpool 3 actually looks like harmless fun. I really enjoyed the second film. Jackman can perform Wolverine in his sleep at this point. I've no doubt about his ability to give a good performance. And if they feel that they have to address the elephant in the room that is 20th Century Fox superheroes of yesteryear now being owned by Disney and Marvel, Deadpool's the one to do it. There's a lot of opportunities there for good awkward meta humour. So, why, with all this extra narrative effort put in place to reassure audiences that they aren't contradicting Logan, does Jackman coming back still make me feel like we've lost something? Well see, Logan was so much more than just one final excuse to see Jackman dicing and slicing his way through tons of bad guys. The core premise of Wolverine, the character, is that he's this persecuted outsider whose humanity was zapped away by corporate assholes who saw him as a weapon before a human being. And when Mangold's Logan finally came around, the filmmakers were astutely aware that we'd watched Jackman's depiction reclaim that humanity in real time over almost 10 films. When we meet him in his final adventure, he's a down-and-out limo driver with performance issues, just barely making enough to get by, and caring for an ailing Charles Xavier, with Patrick Stewart also reprising his role. With a deteriorating health himself, the metal on his bones is now poisoning him from the inside out, Logan's spirit is practically on life support. He's ill, apathetic, and suicidal. The big inciting incident is the discovery that he now has a daughter, again cloned from his DNA by the bad guys, this isolated, feral, mostly mute little girl who desperately needs nurturing, which introduces the idea that Logan now has a lineage, something to leave behind once he's gone, and his reluctance to engage with or even acknowledge the relationship between not only him and his daughter, but a rapidly diminishing father figure that once cared for him, is essentially the movie's premise. Can Wolverine reconcile his violent past long enough to appreciate the family and meaningful existence of his present, and in turn leave behind a legacy of someone who was more than the mindless killing machine he was once designed to be?
It was just basically taking off the seatbelt, taking off any kind of restriction, and let's just dive into this character.
They wanted to treat this with as much artistic license as the studio would allow. When discussing the film, Jackman cited westerns like Unforgiven as direct influences. Mangold spoke of then child actress Daphne Keene's standout performance in the same vein as Tatum O'Neal or Linda Blair in Paper Moon and The Exorcist. Keene's own improv during her audition to shout and swear at Jackman in Spanish added so much to their chemistry that it was written into the film proper. Irrespective of the mandated action I'm sure they had to checklist, Mangold and Jackman saw Logan as a real chance for artistic expression, to tell a story about flawed human beings that weren't cartoon characters with an infinite lifespan. Which brings us back to the clone simply codenamed X-24. While he may look like our beloved titular hero, this Wolverine is a monster. He is nothing but this mindless animalistic killing machine. He murders Xavier and others in cold blood, he doesn't speak, doesn't have any sense of free will, doesn't feel remorse, doesn't have a conscience, and like any good Terminator,
absolutely will not stop until you are dead.
Yeah, he adds a physical obstacle to up the ante, but it's very clear to me that Mangold is saying something actually quite meta here. The younger face, the vacant eyes, his designed longer lifespan. Wolverine is literally facing his next reboot. A man who looks just like him but is missing the core humanity that gave his life meaning and that made audiences fall in love with him in the first place. All because this corporation just couldn't stand the idea of him dying and leave well enough alone. They've got another just like him waiting in the wings, ready to replace the old one. And just how does this major company regard these creatures of their own making?
Don't think of them as children. Think of them as things with patents and copyrights.
In a film all about legacy and what we leave behind, Mangold paints this soulless, depth-deprived mirror image of a human being, intended to outlive him and bear his face long after he's gone, as a horror to be feared. X-24 is the version of Logan that never met the X-Men, never had meaningful relationships, never loved, never lost, never learned, never lived. What Mangold is saying is that it was heart that gave Jackman's Wolverine and his life meaning, not his trademark claws, berserker rage, and certainly not his IP business potential to cross over into other Hollywood blockbusters. The same can be said for Patrick Stewart's Charles Xavier. His intended final appearance in Logan was this devastating emotional performance as a deteriorating and confused bitter old man with an ocean's worth of guilt and a loving mentor facing his deathbed with one last lesson to teach.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
It was a shockingly ambiguous and sophisticated development for a character who'd, up till then, displayed only dignity and wisdom. At 76 years old, Stewart even chose to drop a dangerous 21 pounds to physically embody the character in this condition. In the most gut-wrenching scene of all, Xavier's dementia clears just long enough for him to recall and realise the incidental pain he's caused to so many, with Stewart basically bearing his soul, infusing this humanity and weight to a character that can all too easily be depicted as two-dimensional. But Stewart's Xavier died as more than just a cartoon comic book character. He died a human being. Was it sad and maybe a bit upsetting? Sure, but it was meaningful, and it was real. But lo and behold, the MCU came a-calling. So now Stewart's final appearance as Xavier is getting his neck unceremoniously snapped by Scarlet Witch in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. And I guess it's supposed to be okay because he's in the big yellow chair with the 90s cartoon theme blaring in the background. And while yes, one could argue the character is quite brutally murdered in either scenario, I don't know man, one of these moments is surrounded by a story that honours a legacy with narrative poignancy and real dramatic heft, the other is a cameo. One feels like a real person, the other like a toy. A very comic accurate looking toy, but a toy nonetheless. Something else Logan was keenly aware can happen with this kind of material, but managed to traffic into its story, celebrating the significance of its escapist power without necessarily degrading it. And look, I'm not saying the intention to say something artistically with good filmmaking can't also be balanced against making the studio its money back. I've seen it successfully happen hundreds of times. But are we seriously trying to suggest that Deadpool wants to metaphorically dig this guy out of his carefully constructed burial because it wants to tell a meaningful story and not just throw two action figures at each other? Just how forgiving can we be in this landscape where nothing is sacred, and once thought to be meaningful figureheads of stories that moved us, get recycled in projects seemingly made with franchise management in mind first and foremost? It reminds me of David Lowery's The Old Man and the Gun, this infectiously enjoyable laid-back swan song made to honour Robert Redford's cinematic legacy in his final film role. Or at least it was until he rocked up the following year in Avengers Endgame. I mean, if I had a nickel for every time Marvel did this, well, I'd have 3 nickels, which isn't a lot, but isn't it weird that it's happened more than once? I know that there will be people watching this absolutely fuming at their screens, insisting they're not lessening Logan's impact because of this alternate realities plot mechanic. Again, these are not meant to be the same character. But I'm sorry to say guys, it really is as simple as, if Jackman's back as Wolverine, then to me, it absolutely does. Do these films only have to have meaning within the context of their make-believe realities? What about our reality? Do you think that I care that these aren't the same character either? Films don't exist in a vacuum, and their place in history tells us something about who we were as a culture, when and why, regardless of whether big budget or low budget. And your final comment is often the one that leaves the longest impact. Logan was this meaningful fable about life and death and what one chooses to do with the existence they have in the relatively short amount of time that they have it. Jackman and Mangold deciding to definitively close the book on this particular period of cinematic history made these themes of the fragility of life and the inevitability of death, of one's time being over, all the more poignant. In reality, this was that one last fight, one final chance to say and do something real before it all gets stripped away. That's incredibly gripping, and it gave the film a staying power it otherwise wouldn't have had if the studios kept reassuring us that Jackman would return. It saw the limitations of constant never-ending cinematic universe existence and went against that business practice to tell a deeply moving story about finality, something we all have to face eventually whether we like it or not. It spoke to us on an existential human level that we could relate to, one that was artistically worth so much more than 500 future cameos. The hope of Logan isn't in whether or not Wolverine will live to fight another day, but in Laura, in how he paves the way for the next generation to tell their story and live their lives. There's a lesson in that, in moving on.
Let them die. It's really important if you're in anything creative to not run the tank dry, because it could actually never get refilled again. Like if you could really overdo it, so you leave while there's something in the tank, and that will propel you into the next thing. Who knows what the next thing is?
Yes, given their comic book history, it was kind of annoying that the film versions of Deadpool and Wolverine never quite got to meet properly on screen while both versions were at their peak. But also, look what we got despite that. Instead of accepting this, I guess he's back now and he's gonna go raw. Of course, maybe it's not that deep. Maybe they just wanted to have some well-intentioned fun and do what they felt was right by fans. I mean, I'm sure I'm in the minority when I say all this, and there's an argument to be made that I'm naive to have assumed anything was sacred about this sort of multi-million-dollar blockbuster filmmaking in the first place. Wolverine doesn't belong to James Mangold or Hugh Jackman, and the character is destined to mold and change with the times the further away we get from his first cinematic depiction. But I do think it raises a valuable question of just how long can we forcibly keep these things alive before they become shells of what they once were? Logan just doesn't mean what it once did anymore, and that's kind of heartbreaking. I'm sure that I'll enjoy Deadpool and Wolverine for what it is, but it'll be hard to shut down that side of myself that wonders, what if we'd heeded this warning? What if we'd been strong enough to leave it alone? And at what point did all of this become a Toy Story?